Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. For the next item, I am going to be recommending our proposed fiscal year 2021-2022 annual financial plan. So I'm going to get us started with that, and then we'll be joined by some presenters, including Dr. Tigan and Debbie Hargrave with our budget team. But it is truly my pleasure this afternoon to present the fiscal year 21-22 proposed financial plan. You know, since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, all of us as individuals and as a collective society have had to put important goals and plans on hold. And that does include the ambitious plans for Henrico Public Schools that I outlined in last year's recommended financial plan that some of you may recall. But though the public health crisis and its uncertain economic ramifications have delayed some of our plans, this crisis most certainly did not stop them. While our fiscal approach for this school year has been one of prudence and responsibility, our efforts to provide core services to the students has been one of innovation and creativity. And I'm proud of what the Henrico team has accomplished on behalf of students, despite the challenging and unique circumstances. With a hopeful outlook in regard to returning to pre-pandemic operations, we are able to bring forth a financial plan that seeks to restore cuts that were made during the pandemic and puts us on solid footing to work toward bringing other important initiatives to life in coming years. As always, stakeholder input is critical in formulating our plans, and I am grateful that we can continue to invest in the areas our stakeholders have told us are important. You've told us in recent years that HCPS needs to continue to provide more opportunities and support systems for students and teachers alike, and continue to invest in safe and well-maintained learning spaces. In addition, we will continue to invest in our valued employees and focus on educational equity, as well as the social and emotional needs of our students as we pursue the goals in our Destination 2025 strategic plan. Some highlights of the recommended financial plan you're going to hear about in a few minutes are investments in areas such as fully funding all of our existing positions, covering the full cost of employee health care increases, which are about 6% or $3 million in increases, enhancing some of our operations, for example, with bus GPS, and restoring some of last year's budget reductions. So as the proposed budget is going to be presented, some of you will likely ask yourselves, what about employee compensation? And know this, yes, that will be addressed soon. In Henrico, unlike in our neighboring localities, it is customary for employee raises and compensation to be considered together, the schools and general government employees, later in the budget process. So I want to be clear that additional compensation is a goal this year, and I urge you to stay tuned for more information in the near future. Our employees make critical and valued contributions every day to the success of our county, and the school board and I continue to advocate for you, and we feel our county is working diligently to reward you for that service and dedication. So during this trying time, our community's commitment to public education has never wavered. Overall, even with the economic turbulence caused by the pandemic, the general fund budget included in this recommended annual financial plan reflects an increase of $16,212,073 million over the current budget and totals $526 million approximately. That is a 3.2% increase over the current year, and altogether more than 56% of Henrico's general fund budget. Developing a financial plan is a very big task, and developing one while simultaneously tackling public health and economic challenges is even more a mammoth undertaking. And this has only been possible through the teamwork of Henrico County Public Schools budget staff and the Henrico County government budget staff. And I want to express my appreciation to our school division budget team. Debbie Hargrave and the entire team have been amazing. I cannot thank them enough for their work on this effort. I also want to thank Dr. Tigan, who's been filling CFO shoes upon Mr. Sorensen's retirement, for their tireless efforts in putting this proposed financial plan together. And I would also be remiss if I did not thank our county manager, Mr. John Vitolkas, and his staff for their assistance in developing this plan. All of us in Henrico County are lucky to enjoy the unique and generous support of Henrico County Public Schools by our taxpayers, this school board, and our board of supervisors, as well as the county manager. So while this school year has certainly been a challenge and it's required our complete focus, now it is time to move forward together again. And this recommendation, with its investment in those priorities that you have articulated, is a strong start. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Tigan to walk us through the annual financial plan as it's proposed.
Dr. Tigan, I don't know if you've started presenting, but we can't hear you.
Okay. My mic is off. I will try one more time.
We can hear you now.
Thank you.
Okay.
The presentation is no longer showing. It was showing.
Okay, hold on.
There you go. You're back.
It's still not back the right way. We'll continue.
Well, we do have the presentation up now.
Okay, we'll continue where we are with the operating fund summary. The FY 21-22 recommended budget, general fund budget, provides for $16.2 million increase, which is a 3.2% increase over last year's adopted budget, and does indeed restore the reductions to the base budget. Furthermore, the recommended budget provides additional funding for our debt service. As a reminder, the county handles our debt and provides this number to us. By code, it's the local government that issues debt on behalf of its schools in Virginia. There's a 10% increase from last year to this year, due to the debt from the county has issued for our new schools, which impacts all of the other percentages shown here on the slide. You also see an essentially flat budget for our self-sustaining school nutrition program, and we have adjustments for anticipated grants by an increase of approximately $2.3 million. And I'll talk more about those grants later. Healthcare costs have increased 6%, which is approximately $3 million of that $16.2 million target increase. The $16.2 million increase restores funding to our current year base budget. When developing next year's budget, based on input received over the past few months, the leadership team recommended that all reductions not be restored in order to allow for the reallocations of funding to other priorities. Therefore, funding for certain extracurricular stipends and contracts were reallocated to 10 counselors, as well as the GPS tracking system for our school buses. Both address the support and support and safety of our students, and both were funded with CARES Act in our current budget. It is important to note that these increases do not include any potential compensation adjustments, as Dr. Cashwell stated. Any pay increases we would expect to hear from the county, and we are anxiously awaiting them, I know. This slide and the next two slides really just provide a visual overview of the operation budgets, the general fund expenditures, and the general fund revenues. And as you compare last year's operating budget with this year's, It shows the consistency that we see from year to year on what makes up our operating budget, from the general fund to the debt service, school nutrition, and state and federal grants. Again, comparing last year's general funds expenditures with this year's shows the consistency we see from year to year. And you'll also see that over 75% of our general fund expenditures are related to instruction. Comparing last year's operating budget or general fund reserve with this year's, you will see the addition of a yellow wedge that is the target we have been provided for the restoration of the FY21 budget and the increase in healthcare cost. The target amount will be split between local and state funding later in the budget process. Several special revenue funding comes primarily from federal and state grants and reflects specific programmatic needs. For example, we will receive additional revenue to support increased enrollment in the special education regional program, and there will also be an increase in our Title I allocation. For this year, the county transferred fiduciary responsibilities as well as management responsibilities for the educational components covered under the Children's Services Act, or CSA, and this is reflected in our budget. Beyond the baseline, the recommended budget presented to you refers to funding from the county as of now. Budget development in any year is an evolving process. Data continually becomes available and issues evolve, causing projections to be updated throughout the process. The evolution of data and issues is more pronounced as we prepare for the FY21-22 school year. Compensation as a board, you have always made compensation for staff a top priority. The recommended budget does include funding for the anticipated increase in health insurance. And as is a tradition in Henrico, I know we've said this several times today, any changes to pay will be introduced by the manager. Enrollment is what drives the process, and much of our state revenue is calculated based on the enrollment levels of our students, and many of our expenses are driven by the number of students we serve. So it is a critical variable that unfortunately is difficult to pinpoint for next year. Prior to COVID, we anticipated a stable enrollment pattern over the next several years. But for next year, we know that our levels of enrollment are down due to COVID, and we anticipate them to return to pre-COVID levels. Safety protocols, social emotional supports. From the FY 2021 recommended budget, we recognize the need for supports for our students and funded 40 counselors and 2 psychologists and social workers. Post-COVID, the needs for social and emotional supports has dramatically increased. By maintaining some of the reductions to the FY 2021 adopted budget, Henrico County Public Schools is able to fund 10 counselors for next year in the general fund. In the recommended budget, we are also closely monitoring the progress of the governor's proposal that would require the addition of 1 more counselor at the elementary level and 19 more counselors at the secondary level to reach a possible requirement of counselor to student ratio to be 1 to 325 students. As previously stated, the Division of School Leadership and Division of Learning that you heard in the Health Committee update are working on plans to address learning loss through an in-person summer academy and the potential of expanding learning time for all students in 21-22. This additional learning time could mean an extended day or an early start to the school year. Also, with the opening of the holiday edition, as well as the replacement buildings for J.R. Tucker and Highland Springs High School, they are not currently funded for the cost associated with the expanded capacities in these schools. And compensation, as a board, you have always made compensation for staff your top priority. I don't think we can say this enough. And so the recommended budget does include the funding for the anticipated increase to health insurance. The governor's recommended budget was favorable to K-12 education for next year. While that budget is nearly certain to be amended by the General Assembly, school staff will continue to work with the county throughout the process to attempt to identify funding to address these issues from local, state, and federal, and possibly even CARES Act balances as sources of revenue for these initiatives. And as we look at next steps in the budget process, you will notice that we are presenting today, January 28th. As we go into next week, we will have the superintendent and her team will have a meeting with the executive department and the county manager, followed by a public hearing at 5:30 p.m. on February 11th. At our next regularly scheduled meeting in February would be when we would expect the budget to be approved as possibly amended by the superintendent and the board. And then we would go back, it reverts over to the county side for their budget adoption process before any revisions would come back May 13th to our school board. And of course, July 1st is when the funds become available to support the next year. And so Debbie Hargrave, as you know, as the budget director extraordinaire, is here with me to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, board members, that's a lot to digest in a little bit of time. But we are at the beginning of the budget process, so I'll open it up for discussion. Ms. Kinsella, do you have any comments or questions at this point?
Yes, I do. Not many, because I do need to digest.
Of course.
What I just saw, and but actually, if I could address a question perhaps to Dr. Cashwell first, because I have a current year budget question of interest, I think, to our employees. The county manager announced in December that the Board of Supervisors had authorized $25 million to the county's current budget to support pay increases to county employees. And it wasn't stated whether it was going to be paid in the third quarter, which is January, February, March, I think, of this year, or fourth quarter. Do you have any information about that, Dr. Cashwell, since the manager said it in December?
I don't have any further information other than we anticipate, hopefully, in the coming weeks to hear more about that. Not only the impact of compensation on any announcement he might bring forward on next year's financial plan, but on any potential impact to our current year. So I'll keep you posted.
Thank you for that. Okay, now on to the proposed budget. Do we expect more CARES Act funding? And because I look at when I see the summer program, that's immediately what I think, based on hearing possible news reports of more funding being available to schools.
Yes, ma'am. We have received additional CARES Act funding that would be used to help target the learning gaps our students have.
Okay. And then how much is that?
It's around $35 million.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Mrs. Kinsella. I just wanted to add on to Dr. Tigans. I don't believe that we've formally received those funds, but we anticipate such. And the guidance around the release of those funds does have to do with aid for particularly things like learning loss and learning gaps. So we'd be looking to see how those funds could primarily be used for the initiatives you heard about earlier related not only to the summer, but any initiatives that might go into the next school year specifically for learning loss.
Okay, and then we did spend the majority of the CARES Act funding we received in 2020, correct?
We have spent some of the money. There is some money still available.
Okay.
From the ESSER funds, yes. We had received 8.8 million. That has been 100% spent. We received an additional 15.1 million from the county share. That has been 100% spent. And then ESSER funds that we received directly from VDOE, we have spent about 300,000, but we did receive 9.4 million.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. And then in prior years, as I looked at the slide, if I understand it correctly, it was things that are not yet funded. But in prior years, I recall operational funds being included in the budget for things like staff, for our new building expansions and new construction. Was this inadvertently left out of these target funds, or is this possibly going to be discussed next week with the manager and his team and the superintendent? Dr. Cashwell? We do expect funding for our new buildings that are opening and my holiday expansion, right?
Yes, certainly. As was shared at the beginning of the presentation, we are in the beginning of the budget stage. And so while this recommended budget you see reflects the target as we received it prior, we'll continue to work with county budget staff to work on making sure our needs are addressed. And particular priority would be to making sure we have funds in place related to the opening of Holiday, Tucker, and Highland Springs.
Okay, thank you. And then what, at this point, since we are in the beginning of the process, what legislative items are we aware of or concerned that may bring us additional cost if the state level perhaps mandates them but does not provide the funding accompanied with the mandate?
In addition to the school counselors that I mentioned earlier, with possibly lowering the school counselor to pupil ratio to 1 to 325, there's also legislation about providing albuterol inhalers in our clinics for student use. We are required to have MANT training, and also there is some legislation around school nurses, but we don't anticipate that to have an impact on us.
Okay, thank you. And then I guess the only thing that else I'd like to say is just that, yes, I stress the importance of raises for our staff, and but I know we're early in the process. And then, of course, I'm interested to see the funding availability that we'll have for our summer academy to help cover our learning loss. Thank you.
Ms. Shea, do you have any comments?
Yeah, just one. So last year's budget, if we rewind to pre-pandemic life, had a bunch of big wins in them. They are not in this budget. So Dr. Cashwell, can you help explain a little bit, are those items still priorities for the district?
Yes, Mrs. Shea, you're speaking to the financial plan I proposed at this time last year, which did include increasing the number of school counselors. There was an initiative related to reading specialists and even bringing some equity to the levels of staffing for administrators, particularly at the elementary schools. And so those were and still are important initiatives. And so while this budget restores us to where we were at that point, last year, it doesn't move us forward in those initiatives though we will make a little headway with the counselor piece. But as Dr. Tigan stated, we certainly understand the need for counselors was there pre-pandemic. We know that that's certainly even probably more the case, even as we're working with students now through this health crisis and into the future. And again, also watching the legislation out there now regarding to the ratios and whether or not those may necessitate making a change. But of course, we'd expect some state funding to go along with that. But certainly those all remain priority areas for us.
So for clarity, for some of our constituents that, like myself, who were very excited about those items last year and they had to go away, it's not that we've given up on them or reprioritized. It's simply the fact that we didn't have enough to get all those big wins back. But this budget has let us restore ourselves to where we were pre-pandemic, and we look forward to in future years growing that to be able to take care of these needs. Is that correct? Great, thank you, that's it.
Reverend Cooper, any questions or thoughts?
Yes, ma'am, Madam Chair, thank you so much. Dr. Tigan, can you go back to the slide, the FY 21-22 beyond baseline form real quick? So the statement that you had, your third bullet, ensuring student social and emotional supports, can you speak a little bit more about what has been implemented, kind of idea, and what will be implemented?
Well, this goes back to the our initial request was for 40 additional counselors at the elementary level. And while we've been able to maintain, we were able to use 10 counselors this year using CARES Act money to fund them, which of course isn't for sustainability, the way to move forward. And so that's why we reprioritized the reinstitution of some of our things like stipends and other things, so that we could make sure that we kept those 10 counselors because of how much we knew we would need them. Now we know there's still a need for an additional 30 over what we request because of what we requested last year. And then on top of that, we know that that there's more need now than before, but there's also possibility of the staffing level changing for us. I mean, right now, our counselors are working with kids in schools as far as whether it's virtual learning or they're able to meet with them in a school. They are trying to help our kids as they cope with not only maybe some struggles with learning in this new environment, but also struggles at home with families if people have lost employment or lost housing. And so we have our social workers and psychologists that are also helping, as well as our family engagement teams that are really working on supporting our students through this time. I'm not sure I answered your question.
No, but I appreciate that. Again, it gives an idea of where we are, where we need to go, and where we want to go, given our financial limitations, but pushing the envelope to ensure that we want to do that. Are there any other supports planned in addition to higher counseling, any educational partnerships outside to provide supports for students? I mean, is there anything else we can do just outside the counselor context?
Well, with this, definitely with psychologists and social workers as well. And like I say, we also do contracting with communities and schools to help support our families. Adrienne Cole Johnson, our director of family engagement, her team, they do so much to support our students and their families. Moving forward, the need for additional, quite honestly, staff, whether, the priority is on counselors, but even psychologists and social workers to help meet the needs of students are going to be so critical.
No, I agree with that. And another question concerning, we had a decrease in our school nutrition. I think it was about $8 million. So with the summer learning, can you speak to the impact of that, as well as our changes with our food distribution during the pandemic. What's the budgetary situation in regards to, our ongoing efforts to provide food for those who have food insecurity, as well as we look to the summer? How did that be impacted as well?
Through the spring and the summer and into the fall, there's been support through the changes in the USDA and the programs they have allowed our food service staff to do to meet the needs of families that maybe would not normally be accessing free and reduced lunch. Now we've had there's a small deficit as we move forward. But it's really has not been significant. It's been under $8,000 is the differential, but that has been, our food service program has been supplemented by food throughout. At the beginning of the pandemic, we were helping to support some of the food banks within communities, as well as providing food delivery through our school buses and packaging of weekend packs. We've also worked with the Henrico Education Foundation, and they've worked with some of our business partners like the Community Foundation and Facebook to help provide support for our families, some of it in actual food. And we have more recently, since about midsummer, transitioned over to gift cards that we're able to provide to families so that they can go to a grocery store and shop for their own food. And that allows them to buy perishables and things that we might not otherwise be able to do because we rely so heavily on shelf-stable food. And it also allows them to buy things that are maybe more ethnically appropriate for their families and their desires. And so it's been a combination, and it's not only been food services played a huge part in providing continued food supply to our families, but our partnerships with both the Henrico Education Foundation and the businesses they work with have been instrumental in keeping our community fed.
Thanks, Dr. Atkins. Madam Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Atkins?
Thank you, Dr. Tigan. If you could please share a breakdown of how the CARES Act funding was allocated.
Let me see if I've got that at my fingertips. If not, I can certainly provide that to you.
Because the slides we've got loaded up are for the fiscal year 21-22 proposed plan going forward. And I think what you're speaking to is the funds that are currently in place for this fiscal year, Mrs. Atkins, and I certainly want to provide you that. Mrs. Hargrave provided a rough overview of what we've received to date, largely have used that funding to prepare our schools in relation and our staff in relation to things like PPE and other health and safety pieces, as well as funding those additional positions that were alluded to earlier related to the clinic aides and substitutes and the additional staffing that we're putting into our schools to assist with even our limited in-person and our expanded in-person instruction.
Sure. It would be helpful, of course, not in this setting, but at some point to see that breakdown, just a visual of it, and then the potential of what we anticipate receiving.
Yes, ma'am.
Absolutely. We will share that.
Anything else, board members? I mean, obviously, we are at the beginning of a long process, and the financial plan is basically on our agenda from here on out until we approve it. If there's any information that you need from the staff, be sure to let them know, and we can share that. Any other questions before we move on?
Ms. Ogburn, I'd just like to say one more thing, since we've talked about this throughout the pandemic, and I'm certain we were talking about it before the pandemic, though my brain's full, so I don't really remember. But I would like to say that to just bring this forward again, once again, to Dr. Cashwell and the team. I know the team had actually been researching how to better communicate with our English learner families.
Mhm.
And I just want to put it on our radar once again to ask for purchasing some software that helps us better communicate with our EL families and helps us achieve a goal. I believe it's in our strategic plan as well. So I just want to bring that forward.
Okay,
Yes, ma'am.
thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay, thank you. Dr. Cashwell, we'll move on.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board, and we look forward to continuing to keep you informed along the way with our budget process, as well as for your feedback and questions.